Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Training Tidbits podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Cartledge from Animal Training Academy, and I'm extremely excited about having you back here with us today and being back in your eardrums to talk all about best practice behavior management for what is set to be another amazing episode. And I'm so excited to dive in and learn all about today's guest and their learning odyssey. If you haven't checked the past episodes out yet, then make sure to head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and you can listen to them all there, or you can also find them on iTunes or on Stitcher. There is definitely something there for absolutely everyone, as well as some sensational up and coming planned episodes over the next wee while. Just before we do get started, though, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone that listens to this podcast on a regular basis, or maybe you are joining us for the first time ever. This show is so much fun to make, and I get inspired thinking about all the people that have benefited from all the wisdom our podcast guests have shared. Today's episode is, of course, going to be no exception to this. And if you do like the episode today, then please share it as far and as wide as you possibly can. We are going to dive straight in today because I'm absolutely pumped to be talking to someone who, in all sincerity, changed my life and played and continues to play such a crucial role in my development as a lifetime learner. I'm talking about the wonderful Dr. Susan Friedman. Susan is a psychology professor at Utah State University who has pioneered the application of applied behavior analysis, ABA, to captive and companion animals. ABA, with its roots in human learning, offers a scientifically sound teaching technology and ethical standard that can improve the lives of all learners. Students from 22 different countries have participated in Susan's online courses, Living and Learning with Animals for Professionals and Living and Learning with Parrots for Caregivers. She has written chapters on learning and behavior for 3 veterinarian texts and is a frequent contributor to popular magazines. Her articles appear around the world in 11 languages. Susan has presented seminars internationally for a wide variety of professional organisations, such as the Association of Avian Veterinarians, the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, Moorpark College Exotic Animal Training and Management Program, the NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. She has also been nominated for the Media Award given by the International Association of Behavior Analysis for her efforts to disseminate to pet owners, veterinarians, animal trainers, and zookeepers the essential tools they need to empower and enrich the lives of animals in their care. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Susan to the show today. Susan, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you for the comments about my influence over your understanding about behavior. You've been influential in my work too, as I've watched your passion and persistence to produce these podcasts and that beautiful website.
Well, thank you very much. That's a massive honor to have you say that. And we'll dive straight into the first question today, Susan. Could you please take us all back to where you first started applying ABA to animals and share stories from some of the first animals you ever used it with?
Really, the beginning was getting a parrot myself to add to my menagerie at home with my constant fascination with behavior. And after getting this parrot, I did what so many of us do. I read voraciously everything I could find, which was mainly pop magazine literature rather than research literature. And I was so stunned. This was in about 1997. I was so stunned at the literature then, which was so punishment oriented. Things like if a bird bites, throw it to the ground, unceremoniously was the exact quote I remember so well, and other kinds of misunderstanding about how behavior works. And so with the urging of Bobby Brinker, who is one of the leaders in companion parrots in this country and has several listservs that are very popular and have really been sustained for a long time, I started to write a little bit here and a little bit there. I wrote the first ABC assessment on a parrot, so-called screaming behavior, to one of her lists that had over 1,000 people, and not one single person answered my email. It just fell on just dead earth. I think people must have been wondering, who the heck is this? And what the heck happened? What is she even talking about? So that was my beginning. And it just, led from one thing to another. It's such a powerful set of information to improve the quality of life for all learners that, once I started, it just snowballed massively.
And how do you feel about that? You put this post up about ABCs in the forum, and you have a background working with this technology in other areas. And you could, I'm making an assumption here, please tell me if I'm wrong, you could kind of very clearly see the application to the parrots.
I could clearly see it to everything that we do. I've always felt, or mostly felt, a kind of compassion for what we're asking people when we ask them to change their complete understanding of how behavior on the planet works. It is such a paradigm shift. I think it's very demanding for people to understand some of our most basic tenets. For example, that problem behavior is not inside the animal, it's in the environment. And that all of the punishment that we've experienced and that we ourselves have delivered to other individuals was likely unnecessary. I mean, for us to rake through our own history with punishment and decide that it's not necessary, I think is asking a lot of people. So for the most part, I've been pretty patient with letting this sort of turn over.
Yeah, well, I think you've done an amazing job. And if those people that read your ABC post back in 1997 could see you now, is that post still online? Do you know?
Well, it probably is. As I say, Bobby Brinker has run these lists, these informational and support lists for a very long time on her own server. And I've forgotten right now what it's called, but we should Google her name just as a walk through history and see if we can find that list. And it's probably also on my computer somewhere. If I find it, I will send it to you.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. So you got your parrot for the first time, and you immediately just started looking at behavior of this animal through your, I call them, and I think you potentially might as well, others do, your applied behavior analysis glasses, and just started figuring things out.
It wasn't that automatic for me either. My mentor is a professor in behavior analysis called Carl Cheney, and he has been a real notable and important contributor in his career. He's about 85 now, and I'm very lucky to have him to take to dinner and lunch and continue my learning and have somebody behind me to check things out with. But I recall we had just returned from Africa. We lived in Africa for 5 years, my daughters and husband and I, after getting our first parrot. I met him in the pet store and we greeted each other after not seeing each other for such a long time that I'd been out of the country. And I said to him, I have a parrot. And they don't respond to punishment like other organisms do, because that was the going assertion of all of these lay experts and influencers of the time. And he looked at me in his inimitably grumpy way and said, really, I don't know why that would be. Why would parrots be different than any other living organism on the planet? And he picked up his cricket and walked out of the pet store. And I was left in the pet store with my mouth just open, and I had still never been able to explain why I needed him to remind me about what I know and the trans-species relevance of this information. From that day on, I was wearing my ABA glasses with my...
And we'll go to the next question shortly. Just finish up on that. That kind of does a full circle back to what you were saying about people who are reading your information now and have to kind of acknowledge I don't know if this is the word that I'd like to use, but for speed of getting this idea out, the baggage that they hold with them of using punishment. Is that kind of something that was...
is a great metaphor. We need to cut it loose. Even for me, who had this, long-standing graduate level education and experience using ABA, I needed that nudge to just connect the dots to what I knew about people behavior to non-human behavior. And I have to say that I have learned so much more since that point, because working with stellar trainers who we share in common as mentors, like Steve Martin, Wouter Stallard, Chris Jenkins, many others, I've really learned a much sharper edge to how to apply this information.
Yeah, and love your partnership with the Natural Encounters crew and the cool stuff you do. Absolutely wonderful, and love hearing about your behavioural odyssey. So thank you very much for sharing that, Susan. For the next question, I wanted to please discuss the use of labels when communicating and/or thinking about our animals' behaviour. and cover some potentially undesirable consequences of using labels in this fashion.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I just had two incidents yesterday and today with human behavior, which I don't often think about in terms of labels very much anymore. I'm so focused on the non-human learner label problem. But I was reading an article by a professor who was talking about why it's so difficult to get people to acknowledge their sexism and to change their behavior. And what she wrote in the article was the research she had done operationalized or observably, measurably described sexism as things like interrupting women more than men interrupt one another. And it just really opened my eyes to that issue again, that we call people sexist, but it's just a label. They don't have that inside their bodies. If we could articulate what the behaviors were that earn that label, then we could teach people to be more sensitive or to build different repertoires that would earn them labels like being very open and not sexist. So I know it's a shift to go from animals back to people, but it was so interesting for me to realize how widespread this problem is. And the other one was today I was having a hard time, having just come back from a trip, getting back on my elliptical to do my morning exercise. And I was thinking to myself, I'm so unmotivated. And then I remembered that motivation is not a thing, it's a label. And that behavior is not what's inside me, it's what's inside the environment. And so I turned on a really excellent television show. And suddenly I was motivated enough to go beyond the 30 minutes to an hour and a half on the elliptical and the bike. And I realized again, it's in the environment. The solution is in the environment. Our behavior reflects the arrangement in the environment. So if we bring that now back to animals, it's all over. We hear people talk about animals that are stubborn, hormonal, dominant, and just like sexist and motivation, we have to keep remembering that foremost before we do anything to work with animals, that those are labels. Those are not things. These labels are adjectives, and we're looking for verbs to describe behavior, doing, action words. And when we use these adjectives and over rely on them, we start to think of them as tangible things, but they have no form. They have no tangible form. Labels are concepts and abstractions. And how could a concept cause something? So how could my lack of motivation cause my lack of exercising? How could someone's sexism cause their interruption behavior? How could a bird's hormonal status or dominance cause its biting behavior? Those are concepts, and intangible abstractions can't cause anything. They have no form to have a force over behavior. So that again brings us to understand that if we could move away from labels and talk about what the animal's actually doing, like with the human interrupting or with the bird biting, and describe the conditions that set the occasion for those behaviors, and then give behavior value to the animal, we would understand what is causing the behavior. And it will be in the environment. And then we can change the environment. We have so much power to influence the environment in which our learners behave, that if we keep putting the responsibility for their behavior inside the animal, we're giving away the very power we need to help them, which is to redesign the environment for different behavior, successful behavior.
Yeah, and one other area I just want to touch on quickly, because it's something that really resonated with me when I started learning about this stuff from you. And I'm curious to explore it for the potential it has to help other trainers move forward as well. Is that something you wrote in your article and potentially you presented on 2010 at Parrots in Australia, was that this has the ability to make us not try to change the environment because we're placing that blame in the animal and therefore there's nothing we can do.
That's right.
Can you build on this a little bit?
Yes, we don't want to give that power to change behavior away by mistakenly putting it inside the animal. And when we can't change animals directly, animals are responsible for their behavior. But what we can change is the environment. We can make the right behavior easier and more reinforcing so that the animal, with its control, chooses to do the behavior that we need them to do. It needs to be a dialogue. There has to be mutual outcome. And I resist saying the word reward. Since we last worked together, I've really gotten passionate about encouraging people to rethink their use of the word reward. because I think rewards tend to be trivialized or thought of as mundane. Oh, you're just tossing cookies, and that's how you coerce animals to do what you want. The word reinforcement, it means something different than rewards. Reinforcers strengthen the behavior they follow. Rewards may or may not strengthen behavior. They're often delivered way too far after the behavior of interest, the target behavior already occurred. For example, again, with human behavior, those bonuses that we get in December may encourage us or produce emotional liking, satisfaction, and happiness with the place we work. But those end of the year bonuses are not reinforcing specific behavior because they don't happen immediately upon the behavior occurring. They have no contiguity, is the science word. They're not touching target behavior. So rewards are useful that they may make us happy to be around someone who's very generous with rewards. But unless those consequences are used in very specific ways, that is contingently and immediately and with enough magnitude to match the effort the animal puts into the behavior, etc., all the things we know that maximize the effectiveness of reinforcement, then those rewards may not be reinforcing. And I think that if we started to use the word reinforcement and teach people the nuanced difference between a reward, which acknowledges the behavior and results in good feeling emotions, from reinforcers, which strengthen specific behavior they follow, that we would do our teaching better, more precisely. But we would also educate the lay population that we're not just talking about simple rewards like trophies and pats on the back necessarily. We're talking about strengthening behaviors that will make each individual more successful, and that you need to have an education to know how to do it well, and you need to have experience to know how to do it well. It's so much more than just wrapping up a prize and handing it non-contingently to somebody who's done well last month.
So many gems in there, Susan, and I really want people to cement this stuff in their minds. And going back a wee bit now, I know you've got some great articles on this stuff stored on your website, don't you? So there's one specifically on the use of labels. And then I love your term. This is quite ironic. I love your terminology to mold. You wrote an article on this subject as well. So I'll link back to those, should I? And people can kind of go back and find more information.
And I always remind people, we're not talking about an extensive vocabulary. Like if we were going to learn Chinese, we're talking about a basic vocabulary of 15 words. And the nuances that each of those words carry is so important to the precision of doing the technology. It also unites us as a profession. Imagine going to the heart doctor and him saying, well, that pump in there, you wouldn't expect him to talk in lay terminology, like calling your heart a pump, or your knee that bendy thing. You would expect that a professional has a jargon that defines their education and experience. And so that's a benefit too, is that we all, trainers and behavior analysts, come together around a common language. And I think that that's a very important benefit as well.
Fantastic information. And thank you so much for sharing. I'm so glad that we got an opportunity to talk about this today, because it is such an important element of what we do. Moving on to the next question, I was wondering if we could please cover problem solving next, with what we might label as undesirable behaviors from our animals. How would we go about doing this from an ABA perspective? And could we touch on a really helpful tool that you have devised to assist people with this?
Yeah, I use the expression spaghetti on the wall. Do you use that expression when you're cooking spaghetti? You throw it on the wall to see what's...
I'm glad that you brought that up, because we've talked about, someone's actually quoted you in saying that before on this podcast. Valda mentioned that you said that. So I'm glad we got an opportunity to talk about this today and discuss in more depth what that means.
Yeah. What I mean by that is we shouldn't be casual in implementing our technology to replace problem behaviors. We should be systematic. And that idea of when spaghetti is done, you throw it on the wall and some of it sticks and some of it may not. And we want, when we intervene on an animal's functional repertoire, we want to make sure that everything we do sticks. And when I say functional repertoire, what I mean is we understand that animals, all of us, behave for a reason, and that reason is in the outcome of behaving. Our outcomes historically allow us to choose behaviors that predict the most valued outcomes now. And so behavior has the function of producing outcomes. No animal repeats behavior to be ineffective. We're all born with this behavioral system, which is the product of our evolution, and the function it has is to act on the environment in ways that give us feedback in the way of positive reinforcers, things that we value that we want to get, and things that we don't value that we want to avoid or escape in the future. So behavior has function, and that's one of our most basic. So when an animal is engaging in a behavior we identify as a problem behavior, and I'm comfortable with doing that. It could be for their health and welfare in some way, and it could even be for the ease of keepers and trainers. All of that is understandable to take a look at and want to influence. But I think the first step in solving these behavior problems is recognizing that for the animal, that behavior has function. It is producing something of value, or their biology would disallow them from repeating a failed behavior. And I think that bringing behavior and learning under the wing of biology where it belongs is one of those paradigm shifting points of view. And we are doing that more and more in behavior analysis as we get more experience and more information on contemporary genetics and neuroscience. We understand that consequences influence everything about us, our genes, our brains, and our behavioral repertoire. So when we ask an animal to change a behavior, we're asking them to give up reinforcers. And so we need to be mindful of replacing those reinforcers for an alternative behavior rather than just eliminating the problem behavior, which had function for the animal. By function, again, I mean it produced reinforcers for them. So we're going to want to not just leave a hole in their behavior budget where reinforcers used to be, where functional behavior with reinforcing outcomes used to be. So we need to first do the ABC assessment, which is called functional assessment. And that is one of applied behavior analysis's tried and true tools from way back. In the late 40s, I believe it was, when Skinner argued that the ABC was the smallest meaningful unit of behavior, that to talk about behavior in the absence of conditions, antecedents and consequences, was like talking about the blink reflex or goosebumps in the absence of the cold air that produced it. Behavior doesn't occur without conditions. It never occurs in a vacuum. So it doesn't make sense to think about a problem behavior as just the behavior. We need to ask, what are the antecedents that signal to the animal, do it now and it'll be reinforced? And then what are those reinforcers? And then our goal in solving behavior problems is twofold. If possible, we try and meet two goals. The first is to protect those valued reinforcers. How do I know they're valued? The animal wouldn't be behaving in this problematic way if they were not of value. That's part of their biology. It's part of all of our biology to do what works again. So we want to see if we can protect those reinforcers, but make them contingent on more appropriate or helpful behavior. And then the second goal is to teach new skills, always to teach more and more, building bigger and bigger repertoires, which is just another way of saying we're giving animals more and more ways to control their reinforcers through behaving. And that's a beautiful thing. When animals have very limited behaviors with which to control their outcomes, that's when we use labels like unhealthy or depressed or anxious and fearful. When animals have very large repertoires of behavior with which to control their outcomes, that's when we see these really vibrant, enthusiastic behaviors. So that's a little bit of the problem-solving strategy we use in behavior analysis. That is to never work with anything smaller than the full ABC unit, because behavior never exists without antecedents and consequences. We try to identify what those are, those related functional signals and outcomes, antecedents and consequences, and then we try and replace the problem behavior for the same reinforcers the problem behavior produced, but with a better behavior. And we teach new skills all the time. New reinforcers too.
And one thing that revolutionized my thinking and helped me and changed the lives of so many animals in my care over the last 10 years is your functional assessment and intervention design document. Are we able to share this on the write-up for others to check out?
Absolutely. And if people have questions, I know that you're skilled at using it. I'm sure you can help, and I'm happy to answer email questions as well. There's also a couple of articles that describe how to use it in addition to the worksheet itself. And you're welcome to take that and post that as well.
Yeah, we're going to have a big list of things for you guys to check out on the podcast right up for this episode. I've absolutely devoured those articles years ago and still refer back to them on a regular basis. There's a ton of value in the resource area on your website. One interesting point you made, and just before we move on to the next question, because I use the term undesirable behavior, and I always have to put a disclaimer after that this is undesirable from our perspective, not from our animals' perspective. Is there a term you've come across that's helpful for learners to appreciate this label that we might use for our animals' behavior to describe to them, hey, this is not a behavior we want, but it's got function for the animal?
Exactly as you said. I'm comfortable using undesirable behavior, problem behavior, behavior problem. We need a way to communicate that we're going to embark on a teaching training program. And at any time, anyone should be able to ask us, why is that a problem? And we should be able to respond in a way that makes clear that the animal's quality of life will be improved as well as our own. So there may be times when our only rationale is because it is better or easier for us. An animal shifts at a certain time of day because we don't have staff available. But I think those are important to separate as resource issues rather than actual behavior problems. So there's a certain set of behaviors we may need to change because our resources can't accommodate that behavior. That's different than those behaviors that are problematic for the animal, like stereotypic behavior that happens so frequently it begins to eclipse other behaviors in the day, or problem behaviors like self-injurious behaviors, or even behaviors like not going outside of a barn is ultimately a welfare issue. Although the animal might not, like a child, might not agree and hold the information we hold that justifies us changing their staying in the barn. I don't worry very much about people misassessing what is a problem. In my experience, I can't remember a time, I'm sure it must have happened, where I thought to myself, well, that's not a worthy behavior to change or to replace. I think that people in our profession are pretty accurate about assessing when an animal needs to be pressured to be asked to change what they do. Yeah. So I take the air quotes down on that one and give you permission to just say it, and then you'll add the caveat to new people to explain that from the animal's point of view, it has function, but the function may not be healthy, much like a drug addict.
Your animal is like a drug addict. I'll start with that. Air quotes. I might add air quotes to that one.
I'll put air quotes on that one too.
Great distinctions, and I have the feeling we could talk about this all day, and I know it's just going to be so beneficial for everyone listening, so thank you very much for sharing. Next, Susan, I would like to talk about a phrase, most positive and less intrusive, what this means, and about the behavioral change hierarchy that I believe you came up with, and some particular images that you've created that help get this message across.
Yeah, the concept of the least restricted or least intrusive solution is one that is found in medicine and in law as well as in behavior. And so it has cross professions that are involved in serving individuals in one way or another. I first learned of it as a young student working in special education with children with autism or other special learning needs. And it became part of a law. I believe it's a law throughout Australia as well, where Australia, like the United States, was one of the very early adopters of behavior analysis in figuring out and exploring ways to apply it well. And of course, I think it was Albert Einstein who said something like, science tells us what is, but not what to do. And so our experimental behavior analysts could tell us what are the fundamental principles of behavior and behavior change. But it's up to us in the applied professions to come up with an ethical standard about what to do with those principles. And it's in that spirit that in the United States, similarly in Australia, laws were passed that protected children to be educated in the least intrusive setting, the most positive, least intrusive. In my background as a special educator, there are two influential authors who have a wonderful textbook, Alberto and Troutman, and they created a 4-part hierarchy of just the behavior reduction procedures, that is extinction and negative punishment, meaning timeout, and response costs escalating to positive punishment. And when I realized that we didn't really have that kind of ethical standard expressly in our work with animals that described procedural decisions we need to make from this least intrusive view, I took their idea of a hierarchy and I expanded it to be more inclusive of all the things that we are responsible for in caring for animals. So that hierarchy would start with nutritional and health matters and the physical environment that we are doing so much to improve nowadays. So many wonderful changes as we refocus our attention from naturalistic looking environments to environments that encourage naturalistic behavior, not just the look, but actually behaving organisms in those pretty enclosures. And then it goes from there to antecedent changes, all the way through positive reinforcement, negative punishment, and positive punishment. And the vision we should all have is one of perhaps a funnel where we are using the more intrusive procedures very rarely over the course of caring for an animal or over the course of our career. And when I put that article out and the different graphics to describe it, it really was in the spirit of being a researcher that you put out a finding, or perhaps a philosopher, you put out an idea, and you expect that people are going to really chew on it and debate it and disagree, and that together we'll just keep getting better and better about this ethical issue. So I don't feel that it's set in stone in any way, although it has stood the test of time now since the early 2000s when I first put it out. And APDT, a notable dog organization, and IAABC, a notable animal behavior consulting organization, have both adopted as part of their ethical standard. Well, it's been funny because complete polar opposite things bother people. I have been criticized about that hierarchy. One person wrote to me and said that positive punishment shouldn't be on the hierarchy, and because it is, I, Susan, am responsible for any punishment that now occurs. And on the other hand, some other people tell me that they shouldn't be told that they should start with the lower, less intrusive procedures like antecedent arrangement and positive reinforcement if their personal experience is vast enough that they can eyeball an animal and say, I know I need to start with negative reinforcement because of all the many examples of animals very same behavior pattern. So why waste the time of needing to start with less intrusive first, antecedent arrangement, positive reinforcement first? And so it's been kind of, interesting in a positive way to hear these completely mutually opposing criticisms. And maybe that's a good sign that the hierarchy is just hitting right in the middle, making both camps think about what they're doing. That would be a wonderful outcome. But to the people who say we should not use positive punishment ever, I humbly ask, what planet are you living on that you would want to put your hand on a hot stove over and over and over, that certain behaviors were not immediately producing aversive stimulus that taught you don't do that again. That's not in your survival interest. So I think for me, it's enough to say we should use positive punishment very rarely, but that it's part of life on the planet. And in many ways, it's even part of the challenges we surmount that make us feel enriched. So for me, it's a quantity or a frequency issue, not a use it or never use it, black and white binary decision. And then for the people who say that they're experienced enough to know that that giraffe needs negative reinforcement to be moved out into another enclosure because they've seen so many giraffes before who didn't respond to positive reinforcement, shaping, and so forth. Or people, I have heard one person say they know dogs, and that when a dog does that certain behavior, they need to go right to negative reinforcement because they've got so much experience to be able to predict that positive reinforcement won't work. I remind them of that phrase that I use, the study of one, that each giraffe is not just a member of a species or a member of an individual trainer or consultant's experience bank. Each individual giraffe is really a culture of one, or a species of one, that particular individual. And even if I had worked with 1,000 children who needed negative reinforcement for a particular problem, the next child, that next little Sarah or Johnny, has a right to be treated as an individual and to have their need for more aversive procedures be tested by trying less intrusive procedures first. So I'm glad to have the opportunity, and I hope I didn't take too much time on that answer, but I feel like I said the whole thing on one breath. But it's so important for me to take this opportunity to make that point, that no matter how much experience you have with a particular behavior problem or species, ultimately each individual brings their own genetics, brain, and behavioral history, learning history to the table. And I would never want to assume that because the past 100 needed negative reinforcement, this individual animal in front of me won't respond to positive reinforcement. We must give that animal the opportunity to show us with their behavioral data whether they need to be treated in a less, more intrusive way or not. So that's kind of enough. You can tell us a lot of time thinking about these things.
And this is where I think the listeners of this podcast draw the most value. It's from our guests coming on here and deviating from the question and letting their passion speak through. So thank you very much for that. A couple of things, I just wrote something down. Firstly, I think it's the first time we've ever had Albert Einstein quoted on the podcast. So glad that you could be the one to do that.
That's my honor.
When talking about punishment being on the hierarchy, one thing that really helps me think about its use, I'm talking about positive punishment and negative punishment as well, is you've got another diagram where you've kind of got a roadmap, and when we go past antecedent arrangement and positive reinforcement and we're driving down the road and we're going to turn off into the more advanced areas, you've got speed bumps and you've got stop signs. Can you signify the importance of these elements of that diagram? And I'll link to these diagrams in the
excellent
write-up.
And there are several, and you're very welcome for everybody to use them in whatever way, print them. Anything on my website can be printed and used in whatever way is useful for you. That roadmap one is a popular version. People have given me the feedback that they understand it well, my points well, from that particular graphic. And it shows a small car going down the highway with all of these exits. They are the decision points in our training about whether we should escalate to more intrusive procedures. And as we get past positive reinforcement to the differential reinforcement procedures, that is differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, DRA, differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, DRI. There's a host of more different kinds of differential reinforcement procedures, that there is a speed bump that causes us just to slow the car down, as speed bumps do, and a yield sign that just says slow down, that when you move from positive reinforcement into differential reinforcement, which is one of our strongest tools for sure, because it allows us to reduce problem behavior with reinforcement by combining reinforcement and extinction together. Nonetheless, because it has extinction of the problem behavior involved in it, we need to reconsider, is there no less intrusive way than bringing extinction to the table, even though it's mixed with other fare, our positive reinforcement for the alternative behavior. And then as you go from differential reinforcement into negative reinforcement, negative punishment, and extinction as a standalone procedure. I put those three together because I don't know of any data to lead me to believe that they are always rankable. I think it really depends on the individual, their history, and the trainer, what they're doing. But when you move from differential reinforcement into that category, there's a bigger speed bump and a bigger sign. And then before you move into positive punishment, which I don't recall in 40 years of working with behavior having used with, or I should say really 20 years of working with non-human animal behavior, seeing a time where positive punishment was the only approach that would be effective. So it should be very rarely used. There's a giant speed bump and a big roadblock. And again, it's about acknowledging that we are on a planet where all of these forces move our behavior, but that we can use them disproportionately. If we use positive punishment rarely and positive reinforcement and antecedent arrangement very frequently, then we're also protecting the emotional well-being of the animal and their ability to control their own outcomes, which is more apparent when we change the antecedent environment and give them choices through positive reinforcement than it is when we use positive punishment, where they have no choice. They have behaved, they can't get that behavior back into the present, and they will experience the positive punishment. They can't escape it with their behavior. That's pretty strong stuff. So we want to use it as little as possible. So that's what that picture is, meant to make us slow down before we move to the next level of intrusiveness.
Yeah, and the way I interpret it, and let me know if my interpretation is how you envisioned it being used, is I get to that roadblock or I get to that speed bump, and then I want to acknowledge, as I did at the start, that all animals are individuals. And just because I've done this maybe 1,000 times with 1,000 different animals of the same species and the same behavior and read it in books, this animal's different. And therefore, those speed bumps tell me to pause, slow down, and to seek help and to brainstorm and to be creative. Is that...
That's really a great addition, to seek help, to brainstorm, which takes more than one person in a room, and to be creative. I always acknowledge that I'm just a happy messenger. There are so many important people that keep my teaching flighted, in the air. I would not pass from positive reinforcement to differential reinforcement. I do, but from differential reinforcement to negative punishment, or certainly not positive punishment, without bringing together expert trainers and people in the field to help me see what I was missing. Yeah, I would assume I was doing something wrong. I was missing something before I would move to those more intrusive procedures.
Back to the information gathering stage and seeing what we've overlooked. And when I participated in your online course, Living and Learning with Animals, way back in 2010, one thing that still sticks with me to this day is you shared an idea or a study, both, that there is more difference within species than between species.
Yes.
Can you just add that?
Yes, that stuck with you because it's very important. It really shines a bright light on this notion that each animal we work with is an individual, and it's their individual data that guides what we do, not our preconceived or our experience-based knowledge from the past. That's always there to inform, but not to lead. What leads our decisions is the animal's behavior in front of us now. And that is a statistician's tenet, I would say. Statisticians will say that given any measurement of two different populations, whether it's sea lions and seals, or poodles and Dalmatians, or boys and girls, that when you compare on any measure those two frequency curves that are plotted from your measurement of a population, there will always be more within group variability than between group variability. That is, one boy will be more different from the other boy on the far other extreme of that curve than boys are in general from the average of girls in general. Or if we were to do it with sea lions and seals, I think that was the example I may have used in class, we would agree that in general, sea lions are more vocal, but that is not then seals, but that is not to say that a particular seal isn't going to be as vocal as the average sea lion, or a particular sea lion that we work with is as quiet as the average seal. And the variability around the mean of vocalizations on the sea lion curve will have more variability than the two means sea lion and seals will compare to one another. So it's a little bit hard to explain without the picture, but I think the take-home message is that there's so much variability within a species. On any characteristic we measure, we better let that average information fall into our background and let the animal's data today lead the decisions that we're making.
I love that we got to talk about this and to try to take it full circle. Sea lion, seal, boy, girl, poodle, other breed, they're just labels, right?
Just labels, yeah. And it's the animal's behavior that tells us what to do. It's that dialogue or that conversation. This is such an important new approach to understanding teaching and training, that no matter how much you know or how much experience you have, the co-pilot in any training session is the learner. And we distinguish our skill and our talent to the extent that we flexibly allow ourselves to be led where the animal's behavior leads us, just as they are letting us lead them.
So important, so beautifully said, and thank you very much for sharing that. And just one more thing that you touched on there is the APDT has adopted this idea, and you are, for our Australian listeners, going to be speaking at the APDT conference in Adelaide in September, aren't you?
The end of October, yes.
End of October. So if you're in Australia or New Zealand or internationally, you can travel there and see Susan speaking with some other fantastic guests as well. Sadly, we are nearly at the end, but that's okay because we're heading into one of my favorite parts of the podcast show, and this is story time. Susan, can you please share with everyone listening 2 or 3 stories from your experience training animals, working with behavior so far, and some of the important lessons you've learned along the way?
Oh, yes. When I'm asked about stories, I almost always draw a blank because the stories that I keep in front of my mind are the ones with the biggest lessons, and they're usually hard won. They're not always the happy stories. One story I have to share that's been on my mind a lot lately led me to the lesson that there's a difference between resource problems and behavior problems. And so that's been a privilege to have worked with an elephant that engages in self-injurious behavior, which is very similar to the children I've worked with who engaged in self-injurious behavior. And in that case, we were able to change the environment significantly enough by giving lots of alternative, novel, surprise, and variable things to do, as well as other interventions, personal one-to-one trainer time, and some other pretty creative things that the keepers came up with to reduce that self-injurious behavior to near zero for many months. And when it started to creep back into the animal's repertoire, it became really clear to all of us that it wasn't the behavior that was creeping. It was the lack of implementing the program at the highest necessary level that was creeping. And so that's one of my most recent lessons that has really shifted or added something to my understanding of what we're doing at zoos and in other facilities where animals are in human care, is making that distinction between what is a behavior problem and what is simply changeable but hard to manage because we don't have enough staff, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough space. And I'm really keeping my eye out for those because the animals should not be victimized by our lack of resources. So that's one recent story. And I guess another one, maybe a happier one, was when my own parrot was on my daughter's shoulder. She wrote an article, it's on my website, under kids work. She was, I think, 14 years old, and she had a rationale for why she could step outside with the Alexandrian parrot on her shoulder, which of course was not very careful thinking, and the bird flew off. So a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, it was a very dramatic time. Not only, of course, were we heartbroken about trying to get the bird back, but we also maximized the life lessons. So we put a yellow ribbon on the open door of the cage and left it there till we were hoping the bird would come back. And I decided that it was going to be children who would find that bird because adults don't look up, and when they see a giant red tomato beak and light green feathers flying by them, which is completely out of the realm of possibility in northern Utah for an Indo-Asian bird, I figured children would notice that. So rather than going to the adults' places, the radio and the veterinary and so forth, we put out flyers in all of the elementary schools, and we challenged the children to put on their superpower capes and help us locate this bird, that this was their opportunity to be the heroes that they always imagined they could be. And sure enough, 5 days later, I got a phone call. The bird had flown to a little girl's shoulder, and she looked at the bird and knew the bird's name from our flyers. She stayed completely calm. The father reported he was so amazed, and this little girl just looked at the bird on her shoulder and said, "Oh, hello, Veda. It's time to bring you home." And so we were able to get our bird back, and that was many, many years, 15 years ago. But it's certainly one of those white knuckle gripping moments in life that fortunately ended up well, and the kids, as I always say, did not let us down. So there we go.
Great lesson for those working with free flight birds, and your parrot flies off and you're putting up your flyers, maybe drop some into the local elementary schools. That does bring us now to our final question for this episode, Susan. Could you please, in this part of the podcast, take us all into the future and share with us what you would like to see happen over the next 5 to 10 years in the animal training and behavior management world?
Well, I would love to see us refine even further, less intrusive strategies, and for us to be able to better account for animals' need for space, for choices, for problems to solve, really changing how we keep these animals so that they have a way to earn a living with their evolutionary mechanism called behavior. Those would be important things. And I think that a lot of that is resource issues. So we may need to put lots more money and other resource allocations to meeting that kind of goal. And I think that if we can't allow these animals the space and the complexity of environments to use their behavior for a living, that we really need to reconsider holding at least some of the larger ones in human care. So I'm open to that future where we're able to now bring together all of our best professions related to doing this well and seeing what we can do together. I'm very hopeful that now that we're all working together across professions, we'll be able to meet a much higher standard of welfare and really justify keeping those animals with us. I think it also in the future will require more education and supervised experience. It admittedly surprises me how little some facilities support their staff in becoming more educated in the science of learning and behavior change. Zoology, biology, and conservation is not enough for us to provide well. We need people to understand how behavior works and how learning occurs to better provide for them. So I'm hoping into the future that along with those biology and zoology degrees, there will be more behavior analysis courses taught by people who are really expert in that field. And I think if we can pull that all together, then we're going to be able to meet our goal of developing the next generation of conservationists that we certainly need our children to grow into.
Well, we're working really hard to make these things transpire as we move forward over the coming years. As mentioned, that does sadly bring us to the end. But before we wrap up, could you just tell everyone listening where they can go to learn more about you online? And potentially, I'd love for you to share information about something that I found super helpful, and that is your LLA course. Are you running one of those this year?
I am, and it starts this year a little earlier, October 15th. The details are on the website under professional course. It's an 8-week course where we combine slides and videos on a website while we talk on a telephone to go through the basic science of learning, of behavior change, and the application, really cross species. I use examples from as many species as possible, including children and human adults and exotic animals and domestic animals as well. So that course has really been a pleasure. And for people who are interested in hearing the evaluations from prior students, that's also on the website under What People Say. And I thank you for having found it important in your understanding and improving your work. So I really do thank you for that. Also, anything at behaviorworks.org is available for download, reprinting, distribution. One of my favorite experiences was going to a conference and seeing the Unlabel Me graphic on somebody's t-shirt, and it was someone I didn't even know. Didn't know me. So feel free to be creative with all the different graphics and downloads and articles on the website. And then I have a Facebook page since last we talked. That is facebook.com/behaviorworks. And it's very little to do with me and everything to do with our science of behavior change. Every couple of weeks, I put up in a good video that explains a concept or a point write philosophy, whether it's ethics or the science of behavior, and I write a paragraph to leverage the video. So please visit that page. And if you have videos you think would be really great examples of the different principles or successes we're having, I would love to make it a mutual benefit with you and your listeners, because when we put it up on that Facebook page and get 1 million views over alligators learning how to target, then we're really coming together to disseminate this information in a very large way. And yeah, my email is open to your listeners anytime. I hope that I'll meet you on the road, if not on the internet. I'm traveling so much. I'm bound to meet everybody eventually. And I think that's it. Did you have anything else? Did I forget anything, Ryan? You're such a...
I've already done it in this episode, but I just want to speak to the life-changing effect. And I say that once again in all sincerity. It literally changed my life. And I think what I got away from your course was, yeah, cool, I went to the zoo and I did the stuff with the animals, and that was fantastic. That's why I did it. But it transcended my job and went into all areas of my life, because as Chris Jenkins said in our podcast episode together, once you put the glasses on, you can't take them off. And everything you're seeing is just...
I'll quote you on that. It's really true. This information is life-changing for all of us, and I'm very happy to be one of many people to disseminate it.
And as we do wrap this podcast up, Susan, I just really want to express gratitude, appreciation, and say thank you for taking time to sit down with me today and record this conversation. I share a little story with you and the podcast listeners just before we wrap up. An idea that I've always had in life is that if I find a mentor and I want to be like them, I try to read and absorb everything they have and do similar experiences that they have done. And a mentor of mine in my life's been past podcast guest Nick Bishop, and I met him and I said to Nick, hey, what have you read? Who have you met? Who inspires you? And he said, he said Steve Martin. So I went to Paris 2010 and I hounded Steve Martin and hung on him like a fly and was trying to absorb everything I could. And I said to Steve, hey, who inspired you, Steve? And he said, Susan Friedman. And I didn't know you at the time. You were at that conference. And so I thought, okay, God, I'll detach from Steve and I'll go and latch on to Susan. And then I said to you, Susan, who's your biggest influence in life? And you told me B.F. Skinner. And I thought, well, he's no longer with us, so I'm going to learn everything that I can from Susan, which got me in your course and has led to us having this conversation today. So thank you very much for the conversation today. And thank you on behalf of everyone listening to this podcast show and all the animals out there being influenced by people that are influenced by you. Thank you very much for everything that you do.
Thank you as well, Ryan. Lots of love to you and your listeners. I'm always here if you need me.
Fantastic. We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And I want to ask a small favor of those listening. If you do enjoy these podcasts and as a practitioner of best practice behavior management yourself, you feel that the information held within could help others, then please share this episode where you can on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Pinterest, Snapchat, whatever you use, so that as a community, we can do absolutely everything within our power to disseminate this information as far and as wide as possible. And one really easy way to do this, if you're listening to it from a podcast app on your mobile device or smartphone, is that there should be 3 little dots next to the title of this episode. This might change slightly between devices and depending upon what app you're using, but if you click on this, there'll be an option to share the episode, and then you can choose Facebook, email, however you want to, and it's done. Really simple. It takes 30 seconds. If you could do that, that would be super. That's it for this episode, though. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks again so much for listening. Got to truck, baby duck. You'll hear from us again soon.